I was promised a place. But when the papers arrived, my name had disappeared. Those were the words that stunned an entire courtroom silent. A voice the world had nearly forgotten. A woman long caricatured as patient, reserved, and perpetually devoted, who all of a sudden shattered decades of silence with a few words. And in that instant, everything everyone believed they knew about this family came crashing down. She had stood in the background of smiling photos for years, in neatly produced episodes of a reality television program that marketed the dream of coming together. She gave birth, made sacrifices, and poured not only her finances, but her identity into land promised to be her forever home. She had faith in promises spoken around campfires, drawn on blueprints, inked on contracts. No one ever thought she would question. But when the truth came out, it was not simply betrayal. It was erasure. Her name erased from deeds, her work buried under technicalities, her silence turned as a weapon against her. And the people she used to call family, they had signed off on it, all smiles. The courtroom was thick, tense, almost movie-like. On one end, the man who had choreographed the family's narrative for years, now gritting his teeth as evidence piled against him. Opposite him, a woman with nothing but a pile of documents, receipts, emails, and evidence that could dismantle all of it. And if you thought that first line was dramatic, wait until you see what those documents uncovered. The hush that ensued after she spoke was thicker than any gavel. You could practically hear the weight of 30 years hanging on the walls of the courtroom. She didn't shake, she didn't hurry. She just stood there, clutching those thin pieces of paper as if they were both a shield and a sword combined. All eyes were on her, yet her own never faltered. She gazed straight ahead, as if gazing beyond the individuals who had once promised her everything, to a horizon where she was living by herself alone. For so long, her existence had been characterized by silent sacrifice. She had been the one to step aside when debates escalated, who beamed when cameras captured their faces, who created stability so others could receive attention. And while strangers attributed virtue to her patience, insiders understood, patience wasn't always virtue. Sometimes it was prison. The papers in her hand were evidence of just how far that cage had been constructed around her. Receipts bearing her name, with deposits that had disappeared into accounts she no longer owned. Emails that spoke of meetings she had never been permitted to attend. Contracts signed in rush-hour meetings, worded so carefully that her silence was equated with agreement. Every page was more than paper and ink. It was proof that her life's work had been concealed, reworded, and almost destroyed. And still, it wasn't just about forgotten names or doctored deeds. It was about trust. Trust bartered for property. Fidelity traded for silence. Faith converted into fuel for another man's ambition. To the world, this family had been founded on oneness, strength, and mutual sacrifice. But beneath the surface, that oneness had a cost, and only a select few were permitted to receive the payment. She breathed deeply. The courtroom around her shifted. Attorneys looked at one another. Pens drummed anxiously against notebooks, and one man's face grew red, as if each sentence she spoke cinched the walls tighter around him. She wasn't yelling. She didn't have to. The power lay in volume. It was in truth, raw on the page. And if you thought waving those documents in the air was her most courageous act, just wait until you find out how she stumbled upon them at all. The truth didn't land in her life in a dramatic, blinding crash. It came quietly, slowly, in a whisper on the wind. It started with something as routine as a trip to a small-town clerk's office. She had gone there not to provoke anyone, not to cause trouble, but merely to query the ordinary matter of property taxes. Her hands held no more than a folder, her tone gentle as she described her concern. But what she got back in reply was not a response. It was a shock. The clerk flipped through records, brows furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone polite but puzzled. "I don't see your name listed here." He turned the screen toward her. And there it was. The land she had walked across for years. The same ground she had believed was her legacy, but under someone else's name entirely. Her stomach dropped. She convinced herself at first that it had to be an error, a typo, a mistake. She even chuckled unnervingly, attempting to assuage the room and herself that all was well. But as the clerk processed the record, the reality glared back at her in black and white. Her name was never present. The ride home that afternoon was a haze. Her knuckles went white as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind flashing back through memories like shattered film. She saw campfire vows. Each woman would have her own land, where she could build her future. She saw conversations during late-night campouts, where they drew homes on that same ground, and she recalled all the long hours she worked, saved, gave in, not for her but for the dream that they all professed to share. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, with the paper laid out before her, the house as quiet as could be except for the sound of the wall clock ticking away. A thought intruded, slow and uncomfortable. Was this always the intention? She groped for her old files, receipts she had saved for years, scribbled notes hidden in drawers. One at a time, she spread them out, and the more she connected the dots, the darker the picture grew. Emails sent from old accounts, bank transfers showing her contributions, contracts that assured fairness but left most blanks uncompleted. What had begun as a single missing name had grown into a trail of omissions, a silent pattern that spoke a much larger tale. She sat back, her chest aching. This was not a clerical mistake. This was intentional. She had been erased. And if you think that awakening crushed her, you're wrong. It did something else. It fueled her. Ignition. That was the one word for it. When she finally understood that her erasure was not an accident, a deep fire within her flared up. She had spent decades being instructed that patience was strength, that perseverance was virtue. But patience now tasted like poison to her. If she stayed motionless, she would be completely erased. So she started collecting. Slow at first, a receipt here, a file there. She rummaged through boxes in her garage, drawers stuffed with envelopes that she had once believed were insignificant. But each piece of paper was important now. Each number a reminder of what she had received and what was taken away. She discovered bank transfers she had made as down payments, notes scribbled on paper on their shared savings, emails in which they had spoken about constructing houses on Coyote Pass. Trivial things that others would ignore. Dates, signatures, check numbers, became ammunition in her hands. It was no longer about the money. It was about evidence. Evidence that she hadn't fantasized the vows murmured over years of making do. She didn't do this by herself. She quietly contacted an old sister wife, one who had sat across from her in the wee hours of the morning, exchanging visions of freedom. That friend sat silently as she unfolded the papers on the kitchen table, and then, with shaking hands, the friend produced her own folder. It was like looking in a mirror. The same story, the same pattern, names erased where they should have been honored. They put it all together into a chronology. Every receipt, every email was pinned in sequence. A path leading directly to the truth. The land was never theirs. Not on paper, never in the eyes of the law. For all their decades of toil and devotion, they had never been seen. Her determination firmed. She could no longer feign. This was a miscommunication. She could no longer laugh through the pain for public relations' sake. Each page she gathered became a block in a wall of proof, and that wall rose ever higher and stronger with every passing day. She wasn't scheming revenge. She was planning justice. And justice, she knew, took courage. But there was one issue she hadn't anticipated. The further she went, the riskier the proof was, not for her, but for the ones who'd gone to so much trouble to cover it up. Emails whispered of someone making hidden deals. Signatures were hasty and sloppy, and one phrase chilled her. Better if they don't notice until it's done. That was when she understood. This wasn't all about her. It was larger. Much larger. And if you believe amassing evidence was the extent of her fight, wait until you hear what transpired. When she went on to take that mountain of proof before the courts. The courthouse was chillier than she had pictured, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Its walls hummed with the weight of years of stories such as hers, stories of deceit and shattered vows. When she stepped through those weighty doors, folder held tightly against her chest, she felt the weight of each mile she'd traveled to arrive here, not just the miles themselves, but the emotional ones as well. Family members who previously smiled in her direction now averted their faces. She overheard whispers behind her back. Rapid glances darted back and forth like sharp knives. They had expected her not to appear. They had expected her to remain silent, as always. But here she was, at the entrance of fact. Within the courthouse, the air was heavy. On one side was the man she had trusted above all else, his jaw set hard, eyes averting hers. Across from him stood neatly piled binders, and a suit-clad attorney attired in the sort of confidence that only came with money. Across from them, she sat by herself. Only she, her folder, and the bravery to use her voice. The judge arrived, and the courtroom stood in silence. With a solitary thwack of the gavel, her personal anguish was entered into public record. When it came time for her to produce evidence, her hands trembled, not because she was afraid, but because the stakes were so high. Document by document, she placed them out, receipts for the money she'd paid, promises made in emails of shared ownership, even texts outlining the future in detail. She didn't need drama. The truth was loud enough. The attorney attempted to shoot down holes. He questioned why she hadn't said anything earlier, why she hadn't insisted on her name being on the papers from the very start. Each of his questions cut like a knife, slicing into her pride. But she replied serenely, her tone level. Because I trusted him. Because we were a family. Because promises were supposed to mean something. And then, the tipping point. She passed the email, the one line that had tormented her for weeks. Better if they don't notice until it's done. The courtroom realigned. Even the judge's brow creased as the words bounced off the walls. A heavy, damning silence filled the room. The man across the room finally looked up at her. For an instant the facade crumbled. Panic, guilt, the truth, unvarnished and unadorned, flickered before his face as he hid it once more. But she had glimpsed it. Everyone had. Her heart racing. This was no longer her narrative. It was larger. Of a system that had enabled silence to thrive. Of trust having been turned into a weapon. She wasn't merely contesting for her land. She was contesting for acknowledgement, for fairness, for every broken promise. And yet, as great as that was, it was just the start, because the defense wasn't complete, and the tactics they next unleashed would make the courtroom a battlefield no one saw coming. If her proof was a fire, the defense arrived with water, or so they believed. The attorney stood up with a suaveness that indicated this wasn't his first experience of ruining a life in front of strangers. His sentences were fine-tuned, technical, crafted to throw shadows on her reality. He flipped through her papers with the slightest smirk, as if the writing on them was already disintegrating. These, he said, waving a slow hand, are nothing but tokens of goodwill, free donations. At no time did my client offer legal title. His tone was even, but each syllable sliced like glass. He rested on technicalities. The deeds to the land carried just one name, his client's. There was no joint ownership on the bank statements. She had set out every page carefully, and he had contorted it, reframed it to remove all meaning. She saw sacrifice over years, but he drew a picture of a generosity given freely, as if she were nothing more than a visitor in her own kin. And then there came the most crushing blow. A new binder appeared, one she had never seen before. Inside were contracts, neat and official, with her absence glaringly obvious. But the sting wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the signatures. Names she recognized. Names of people she once called allies. Neatly signed beneath clauses that left her completely erased. Her chest constricted as she leafed through the pages. Betrayal now wore a new face. Not only the man who had gagged her, but the members of her family who had silently acquiesced to him, opting for ease over truth. The attorney continued, his voice growing louder with every disclosure. This is not a case of fraud, he stated, but of misconception. My client has at all times acted within his rights. She merely declined to guard hers. The words rebounded, echoing off courtroom walls, until they stuck like rocks in her gut. For the first time, uncertainty crept in. Not uncertainty about her truth, but uncertainty about being able to prevail in a system based on signatures, contracts, and finer points she had never grasped. She shook as she gripped her folder tighter, the papers within now smaller, weaker. She had entered with courage, But the defense was taking it away bit by bit. And yet, deep down, under the fear, something deeper stirred, a fierce flame that refused to be extinguished. Because she understood what they did not. She understood that hidden in those emails and receipts was more than financials. It was intent. Intent to share, intent to build, intent to keep promises made in secret, even if they never reached the paperwork. And sometimes, intent was more audible than ink. Nevertheless, the time was merciless. The courtroom was no longer hers. It was now the defense's beat. Their tactics, their meticulously spun story. Each passing second was a reminder that this was not merely a struggle for land. It was a struggle for her very existence in the narrative. And if you believed the defense was in charge, just wait until you hear about the unlikely ally who came storming in next. An individual who changed the dynamics in a manner that no one could have anticipated. The gavel hadn't even had time to cool from the defense's final words when the atmosphere changed. A door at the rear of the courtroom creaked wide, and footsteps rang off the tile. Heads turned, whispers spread. And then, there they were. A friend she never dared to dream of. One whose silence once burned as cruelly as treachery, now towering in the same place where it all came down to. It was an ex-sister wife. One who had slipped away without a sound years ago, hiding in the darkness to avoid the tempest. People assumed she'd never come back, least of all to protect the very person sitting alone at the plaintiff's table. But there she was, clutching a folder of her own. The judge's brow went up, inviting her to come forward. Even the defense attorney stumbled, his own confidence wavering for a moment, as the presence of the newcomer demanded to be heard. This wasn't testimony. This was a crack in the fortress wall the defense had so meticulously created. She spoke with a steadiness that resonated more profoundly than any yelling ever had. "Your Honor," she started. "I have proof to back her up, and I can assure you that promises were given, not just to her, but to all of us." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The lawyer's smirk disappeared. He attempted to protest, to call the testimony irrelevant, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. The papers traveled across the bench, coming to rest with a weight that could not be denied. Emails, notes written by hand, even tape recordings of meetings where mutual ownership was discussed as a given, not a gift. Now the story wasn't so black and white. The tale wasn't one of free gift, but of calculated exclusion, of a pattern intended to maintain power in one pair of hands, and to string out the other with empty assurances. For the first time, the woman at the plaintiff's table experienced the tide change. Her chest relaxed. She no longer stood alone. Across the room, they made eye contact. Two women once broken by the same man's decisions, now joined by truth. The defense faltered. The attorney rustled papers, turning pages as if the solution would be buried in the ink. His client's face grew red, jaw clenching as he shied from every eye. This was not supposed to happen. This was mayhem. And mayhem was not his domain. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing over the new evidence. The room was silent, thick and charged with electricity. And in that silence, something changed. The sort of change that everyone sensed if not everyone ever did mention it aloud. For the first time during the whole trial, winning didn't seem so unattainable. But if the friend's testimony gave hope, it also opened a perilous new page. For hidden in her papers was a revelation so explosive, so completely incriminating, that once it emerged, it wouldn't only alter the case, it would alter everything. The folder quivered slightly as the ally turned to the last section. Her steady but weighted voice traveled through the courtroom like the eye of the hurricane. She paused. Not through fear, but because she knew that what she was about to reveal would break every remaining illusion. And then she pushed the page across. It wasn't an ordinary email or scribbled message. It was a document signed, dated months prior to the property ever having been given to him alone. A legal draft that included all the wives as co-owners, with witness notations. Their names, in black ink, were present in plain print. And then, beneath the draft, another iteration of the same document. This one alone carried his name, the rest of them scrubbed away, ghosts erased from the face of the earth. The room went cold. gasp broke the silence. It wasn't betrayal anymore. It was intentional manipulation. Evidence that what she suffered was no mistake, but a deliberate choice to manipulate the past and exclude her from a future that she had worked to create. The judge's gaze narrowed, his hand drumming against the bench. "Explain this," he ordered. The friend raised her chin. "We were informed the first draft was an error, that the attorney would correct it. We had confidence in him, but no corrected version ever arrived. Only this, the one you hold in your hand now." The face of the defense attorney went white. He stuttered, protesting that the drafts were not official, that nothing had been agreed to. But the harm was done. The jury and the judge had witnessed the trail. They saw the intent. For the woman at the plaintiff's table, this was the moment. She clapped a hand to her chest, gasping as years of quiet unspooled before her eyes. This was the evidence she had prayed for. The confirmation that her suffering hadn't been imagined, that the vows spoken in secret hadn't been dreams. They had been real, and then taken. But what really shattered the courtroom wasn't the paper. It was knowing that others had known. That signatures from her on subsequent contracts weren't so much betrayals of convenience, but compliance with erasure. It wasn't a single man's choice. It was a web. A constructed silence spun tightly around her until she vanished. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, but she didn't allow them to spill. Instead, she pulled herself upright, firmly. This was her time to take back what had been taken. A recess was called by the judge. The gavel crashed, and the sound boomed like thunder. People stood in a flurry, hushed tones becoming full-blown conversation. Reporters took frantic notes. Family members shifted restlessly, not meeting her eye. And as the courtroom cleared, one thing seared in her mind. If this was just the tip of what had been concealed, what else would scurry into the light? The corridor outside the courtroom crackled with tension. Journalists crowded, cameras flashing, microphones waved like swords. But she buried her face, folder clutched like a shield. She had no desire for headlines. Her war was still raging within those four walls. When court resumed, the mood had changed. The defense, which had been so self-assured and invincible, now seemed tattered. Papers rustled more loudly than they would have to. Whispers extended longer than necessary. And even the man at the center of it all, the one who had wiped her away with the signature on a piece of paper, evaded the glance of almost everyone in the room. But it wasn't only the defense disintegrating. The bombshell proof had shattered something more profound. The family itself. A hushed wave of discord swept across the benches. Some leaned in, visibly disturbed, unable to look at her but not wanting to, no longer able to pretend otherwise. Others folded their arms, expressionless, refusing to give way, even as the evidence mounted and grew more oppressive. And then, as though the air was not already thick enough, the friend who had brought the draft papers disclosed something else. "Your Honor," she said with caution, "this was not a one-time incident. There were other assets, other accounts, where the same promises were made and broken." The words fell like a second gavel blow. The judge waved for explanation, and she slid forward more documents. Bank transfers, side agreements, proof of a pattern years in the making. This wasn't just about one piece of property anymore. It was about a system of domination, a cycle of taking and erasing, concealed in plain view. The defense attorney's voice trembled as he protested, objecting as irrelevant, objecting as conspiracy, objecting as anything that could stem the avalanche, now rushing towards his client. But the judge was unmoved. "We will take these under consideration," he stated resolutely, "and decide their relevance." Across the aisle, the man finally spoke. His own voice, low and quivering with rage, pierced the silence. "This is betrayal. My own kin against me." He glared at the ally, then at her, the woman he had never believed would have the guts to fight. His jaw set as if the pressure of his own fallen empire rested squarely in his mouth. She didn't wince. For once, she allowed his anger to roll over her without recoiling. Because for the first time, she saw his fury wasn't strength. It was fear. Fear of the truth. Fear of losing the control he had established with lies. But cornered fear is dangerous. And she understood deep down. If the courtroom was turning on him, then outside these walls, the real war was only just starting. Because families don't shatter nicely. They shatter, and the repercussions of this case wouldn't remain locked away in legal documents. They would spread into every bond, every partnership, every child caught in the middle. And if you think the courtroom drama was dramatic, wait until you see what was captured when the cameras brought them back home. The courthouse steps were also a battleground. Reporters swarmed up close, their voices competing in a madhouse mixture, each question more biting than the next. Did you know about the doctored documents? Was the betrayal hatched from the start? How does it feel to be erased by your own family? She didn't respond, she didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any line they could publish, but the cameras picked up everything. The way she clutched her folder to her chest, the quiver of her lips, the steel in her gaze. For the first time, the public could view her not as a hushed background presence, but as the woman at the eye of a maelstrom. The man himself, though, wasn't so tactful. He strode past microphones, his voice brittle and crisp. This is nothing but lies. Twisted stories. They're conspiring against me because I kept this family together when nobody else could. His words were full of defiance. But his face betrayed him. Red, tight, perspiring under the ceaseless flash of the cameras. Clips of the scene went viral within hours. Social media erupted. Hashtags coalescing like wildfire. Some of them defended him, characterizing the trial as a witch hunt. Others stood with her, hailing her bravery, analyzing every document, every detail made public in court. Strangers who had never heard of her were suddenly invested, outraged, heartbroken on her account. And as the world outside argued, the world within the family broke down further. At home, doors were slammed. Calls went unreturned. Sides were picked in hushed but resolute tones. A daughter accused her father of breaking vows to her mother. A son turned his phone off altogether, pulling away from the mess. Sisters who had giggled around communal tables now communicated only in brief, clipped tones, suspicion in each look. She sat by herself that night, the house still too quiet, the silence oppressive. Her silence had been survival for so many years. But it wasn't that way now. It wasn't submission, it was contemplation. Contemplation of how far she had traveled, how much had been lost, and how much more she could lose. But even in quiet, the tempest caught up with her. Her phone rang with texts. Some from strangers promising help, some from relatives instructing her to withdraw the case, some from anonymous callers spewing hate designed to crush her spirit. She read them all, and then placed the phone aside. Because for once, she didn't want to be unsettled by speech in the dark. But here's the thing about storms. They don't end neatly. They twist, they shift, they gather strength. And the deeper this trial went, the more dangerous it became. Not just for her, but for everyone tied to the truth. And if you thought the courtroom surprise was appalling, just wait until you find out what went down. When one of the family members, racked with guilt, finally made the switch and broke the secret they'd been keeping all these years. It occurred quietly, without microphones or cameras. No steps on the courthouse, no flashing lights. Only a knock upon her door late at night, when the house was dark and her reserves were depleted. She opened it to see a face she hadn't anticipated. A family member who had firmly remained on the opposite side of the trial. One whose name had signed those binding agreements. Their eyes were bloodshot, their voice shaking. "I can't do this anymore," they whispered, and held out in their shaking hands a flash drive. She said nothing, didn't invite them in immediately. The burden of all those years of betrayal cowed her, but something about their face, shame, fatigue, perhaps even love hidden under guilt, caused her to stand aside. Over the kitchen table, the truth came out. The drive held recordings. Phone calls, meetings, even late-night talks where the scheme had been discussed in stark terms. Talk of how to erase her name, how to get the others to sign, how to make it seem like she was never supposed to be included. Voices that were familiar, voices of individuals she had trusted, talking with callous ease about wiping her out. She heard it without comment, her fingers spread over her lips as the words replayed, each sentence another slash. But this time the wounds didn't take the strength from her. They honed it, because here, at last, was irrefutable evidence, not merely of betrayal, but of intent. Evidence that couldn't be spun into generosity or misinterpretation. Evidence that even the best attorney couldn't spin out of. The relatives' confession did not end there. They cried as they confessed the truth. They signed the agreements out of fear, out of pressure, out of desperation to maintain peace. I thought it was survival. They spoke, cracking voice. But all I did was help destroy you. For a great while, the room was quiet, but for the hum of the refrigerator. And then she said, in a soft but firm voice, "You didn't break me, you just taught me how much stronger I have to be." The confession was the turning point. By morning, the flash drive was in her attorney's hands. By afternoon, rumors of what it contained had already roamed into the courthouse. The defense panicked, feeling the ground falling out from under them. The man who had previously sat so self-assured at the eye of this hurricane now seemed smaller, trapped, desperate. But this is the thing about desperate men. They do not give up easily. And if the proof could ruin his lies, he was prepared to let loose secrets of his own. Secrets that had lain hidden deep, biding their time until they could strike back at the right moment. The war did not end. It was only beginning its most perilous phase.